Welcome to Restoria. I'm Edward, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story ease you into sleep. The Librarian of the Whispering Wood. There was a forest at the edge of the village of Aldenmere where the trees grew so tall their crowns disappeared into low cloud. Nobody could say exactly when the forest had arrived. The oldest residents of the village remembered it being there when they were small. Their parents had remembered it the same way. It had simply always been. The villagers called it the Whispering Wood, not because the trees made an unusual sound, though they did murmur in the wind more softly than trees elsewhere. They called it that because of what happened when you stood very still just inside the tree line and listened. You could hear, if the evening was quiet enough, the faint sound of pages turning. Most people in Aldenmere left the forest alone. Not out of fear, it did not feel frightening. It felt, if anything, the way a library feels when you step inside one on a cold afternoon. Warm, contained, full of something waiting to be found. A woman named Marin had lived her whole life in Aldenmere. She was 43 years old and had worked for most of those years in the village's small post office, sorting letters into wooden cubbies and handing parcels across a low counter worn smooth by decades of elbows. She knew almost everyone in the village by name. She knew their handwriting from the return addresses on their envelopes. She knew who sent birthday cards late and who wrote to their siblings every single week without fail. She was not unhappy. That was important to understand about Marin. She had a comfortable house at the end of a narrow lane, a cat named Fig who slept in the shape of a crescent on her armchair, and a garden that produced more rosemary than she could ever use. She made good soup. She read before bed every night. She was not unhappy, but there had been a feeling lately, a kind of low hum at the back of her chest, just below where the ribs joined. Not sadness exactly, more like the feeling of a sentence left unfinished, a book closed before the final chapter. Something unresolved, though she could not have told you what. It was this feeling that brought her to the edge of the Whispering Wood on an evening in late October, when the light was amber and the air smelled of cold soil and fallen leaves. She had not planned to come. She had been walking along the old cart path that ran behind the post office, as she often did after her shift ended. The path curved gradually east, and somehow, without making a decision, she found herself standing at the tree line with one hand resting on the bark of the outermost birch. It was warm under her palm, not the warmth of a thing that had been sitting in sunlight, something else. The warmth of something alive and, perhaps, paying attention. She stood very still, and she heard it, soft as breathing, the whisper of pages. Marin stepped into the wood. The light changed immediately, not darker, but softer, the kind of light that comes through thin linen curtains in the morning. Diffuse, even, gentle on the eyes. The trees here were birch and ash and something older she could not name, their bark silver pale and their branches threading together overhead like the arched ceiling of an old church. The ground underfoot was carpeted in moss so deep and dense it felt like walking on a mattress. Each step was nearly silent. She could feel the give of it through the soles of her shoes. The sound of pages grew no louder as she walked, but it grew more distinct. It was definitely pages, not the rustle of leaves, though the two were similar. This had a rhythm to it, a deliberateness. Someone was reading, and reading carefully. Somewhere ahead, she followed the sound for perhaps 10 minutes. The forest did not feel large as she walked through it. It felt intimate. The trees were close enough that she could reach out and brush her fingers along the bark as she passed, and she did, trailing her hand from one smooth surface to the next. They were all warm. Then the trees thinned, and she stepped into a clearing. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. There was a building in the clearing, or rather, there was something that had decided, at some point, to become a building. It had walls of stacked pale stone and a roof of living moss, thick as a blanket, from which small white flowers grew in clusters. The windows were round, like the portholes of an old ship, and warm gold light spilled out of each one. Ivy covered most of the eastern wall. Not the invasive, tangling kind, but the neat, intentional kind, clipped to the shape of the wall as though it had been growing there according to instructions. Above the low wooden door, carved into a piece of driftwood, were 2 words: the library. Marin stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment. The sound of pages was coming from inside. She could see through the nearest round window the shadow of someone moving slowly between tall shelves. She crossed the clearing. The moss was just as soft here as it had been among the trees. Her feet made no sound at all. She knocked on the door. The page turning stopped. A pause, as brief as a single breath. Then footsteps, unhurried, and the door swung inward. The man who opened it was old, not ancient, but old enough that his face was deeply lined and his white hair sat in a loose halo around his head. He wore a long cardigan the color of dark moss, patched at the elbows, and he held a book open in one hand with his finger marking his place. He looked at Marin the way a person looks at someone they have been expecting. "Come in," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "You're right on time. I didn't know I was coming," Marin said. He smiled. They rarely do. Inside, the library was larger than its outside suggested. Much larger. The ceilings rose 2 stories above her head, and shelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling, packed tightly with books of every size. Some were bound in leather, deep burgundy and forest green. Some were thin as pamphlets. Some were enormous, the size of a small table, their spines blank. A wooden ladder on a brass rail ran the length of each wall. In the center of the room was a round table of dark oak with 2 chairs drawn up to it. On the table was a small oil lamp, its flame steady and warm, and 2 cups of tea already poured. "Sit," the man said, moving to one of the chairs with the ease of a person entirely at home. He set his book down, still open, and wrapped both hands around his cup. Marin sat. The chair was the most comfortable chair she had ever been in. It was high-backed and slightly worn at the armrests, and it received her exactly as though it had been shaped for her. The tea was already the right temperature. She had not sweetened it, but it tasted faintly of honey anyway, and of something she could not identify. Dried flowers, perhaps, or rain-soaked wood. Something that made her feel the way she felt in the last half hour before sleep, when the thoughts began to slow and the day began to recede. "I'm Marin," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm Aldrich. I look after the library. How long have you been here?" He considered this with the seriousness of someone who found the question genuinely interesting. "I came in autumn," he said. "A very long time ago. The wood needed a librarian, and I needed somewhere quiet." He paused. "It was a good arrangement." "What kind of library is this?" Marin asked. She looked at the shelves around her. The books had no titles on their spines. All of them were plain, the usual kind, Aldrich said. Stories, records, memories written down so they don't get lost. He glanced at the shelves with the mild affection of someone looking at old friends. Every book here was important to someone. Some of them are very old. Some arrived only recently. Can I read them? That's why the door opens. He smiled again. The slow, easy smile of a man who had said this many times before. Marin set down her cup and stood. She moved to the nearest shelf and ran one finger along the spines. They were smooth under her fingertip, worn smooth, loved smooth. She pulled one out almost at random. It was thin, bound in faded blue cloth. She opened it and read the first line. She did not know whose memory it was, but the moment she began to read, she was there. She was in a kitchen in the very early morning, before the sun was fully up. Someone was making bread. The smell of it was overwhelming, warm flour and yeast, and the faint sweetness of a wood fire in the oven. A woman was kneading dough at a table, her arms dusted white to the elbow, working with the patient, rhythmic motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Outside the window, the sky was pale, gray, turning to pearl. A single bird was singing somewhere in the dark. The feeling in the room was profound contentment. Not the excitement of something new or the sharp joy of something given unexpectedly. simply the deep and settled peace of being exactly where one was supposed to be, doing exactly what one was supposed to do at exactly the right time of morning. Marin stayed in that kitchen for a long time, long enough to feel the warmth of the oven, long enough to hear the bird finish its song and the street outside the window begin to stir. Then she closed the book. She stood very still for a moment, holding it in both hands. "Who was she?" she asked. "A baker," Aldrich said from his chair. He had resumed reading his own book, one leg crossed over the other. She lived in a small town in the mountains in 1932. That morning was the one she remembered most clearly at the end of her life. He turned a page. Not her wedding, not the birth of her children, just the bread and the bird and the gray light before sunrise. Marin returned the blue book carefully to its place on the shelf. She pulled out another. This one was thicker, bound in something that felt almost like suede, pale tan, worn to ivory at the corners. She opened it and stepped again into someone else's life. This time she was outside, sitting on a wooden dock at the edge of a very still lake. The dock rocked slightly, just barely, and she could feel the water moving beneath the planks. It was an overcast day, the sky white and even, the lake the color of pewter. There were mountains in the distance, their shapes soft and blurred in the low cloud. She was fishing, not expecting to catch anything. The line hung in the water and the float sat perfectly still. It was the kind of fishing that was not really about fish. A man's hands, old and spotted with age, rested on his knees. His breath came slowly. A thermos sat beside him, one cup poured and cooling. The feeling was solitude, but not loneliness. There was a difference. She could feel it clearly here. Solitude was the thing you chose. The deliberate stepping away from noise and obligation and the constant motion of other people. This man had chosen this dock, this still water, this overcast sky. He had chosen to be alone today, and in choosing it, the solitude was warm. She stayed with him until the float moved once, tentatively, and he watched it with patient dark eyes, and then the fish lost interest, and the float went still again, and he let out a long, satisfied breath. Marin closed the book. She stood in the library with both books now held against her chest, one in each arm. The lamp on the table burned evenly. Aldrich turned another page. "How many books are here?" she asked. "I've stopped counting," he said. "New ones come all the time." "From where?" He looked up at her over his book. His eyes were the pale gray-green of lichen on stone. From people who needed to put something down for a while, a moment they loved too much to carry everywhere, a feeling they wanted to keep safe. He tilted his head slightly. Sometimes people bring them here deliberately. Sometimes the books just arrive. Marin put both books back where she had found them. She stood at the shelf for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly on the spines. "Is there one here that's mine?" she asked. Aldrich set down his book on the table, carefully, the spine up to hold his place. He stood and moved to the far wall, the one she had not yet looked at, half hidden in soft shadow. He ran his fingers along the lower shelves without looking, the way a person does when they know a place entirely by touch. He stopped, pulled out a book. It was small, smaller than either of the others she had looked at, bound in plain dark green cloth, no embellishment. He carried it to her and set it in her hands. She looked at it for a long time before she opened it. When she did, she was standing on the steps of the post office. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in late summer, the sky pale blue, the street quiet. She was 17 years old, and she had just opened the office for the first time alone, with her own set of keys that the old postmaster had pressed into her hand the evening before with great ceremony. She turned the key in the lock and heard the click of it, and pushed the door open and stepped inside into the smell of paper and wood and the particular dustiness of a place that keeps other people's important things. The feeling was enormous and quiet at the same time. Standing at the threshold of something she had not expected to love. Not the job itself, not yet, but the threshold, the understanding that this was a place where things arrived and were looked after and sent on their way, that she was now part of that. She had not thought about that morning in years. She had not realized until now that she still loved it. Not the job exactly, not the sorting and the parcels and the worn smooth counter. The knowing, the being the person who knew where things were and where they were going, the quiet trust of it. The parcels with their careful handwriting entrusted to her hands. She closed the book slowly. The hum below her ribs was gone, not replaced by anything, simply gone, like a note that had been playing so long she had stopped hearing it, and then it stopped. And the silence it left was not empty but restful. "How did you know?" she said. Aldrich was back in his chair, his own book open again. "The wood chooses what people need," he said simply. "I just look after the place." Marin looked down at the small green book in her hands. "Can I keep it?" He shook his head gently, not unkindly. "They're safest here. That's why people bring them." He paused. "But you can come back. The door is always open." She set the book carefully on the table beside his lamp. She looked at it sitting there in the warm light and felt something settle inside her. Not resolve, exactly. Not understanding. Something softer than both. A kind of permission to stop worrying at the edges of things and simply continue. "I should go," she said. "You should," he agreed. "It's getting dark." She pulled on her coat and moved to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "Thank you," she said, "for the tea. Come back on a Tuesday," he said without looking up from his book. "I put the good biscuits out on Tuesdays." She smiled, and she stepped back out into the clearing. The forest was dark now, but not uncomfortably. The birches glowed faintly, as birches do when there is no light to explain the glow. The moss underfoot was as soft as it had been when she arrived. She could see the faint path she had made on the way in, each footprint slightly darker where the moss had compressed. She followed it back the way she had come. The sound of pages followed her for a while, faint as a whisper, and then it faded into the ordinary sounds of the wood at dusk. Leaves shifting, a bird settling somewhere high up, the low creak of old branches adjusting to the cooling air. She emerged at the cart path just as the last of the light left the sky. She stood there for a moment, her hands in her coat pockets, looking back at the tree line. The birches at the edge shone pale and quiet in the dark. She turned and walked home. Fig was asleep in the armchair when she came in. He opened one eye, assessed her, and closed it again. The kitchen smelled of the soup she had left on low heat before her walk. She poured a bowl of it and sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly, looking out the window at the lane. The feeling below her ribs did not return that evening. It did not return the next morning either, when she unlocked the post office and stepped inside to the smell of paper and wood. She stood in the doorway for just a moment before she went in, the way she had stood there all those years ago, and felt the weight of the keys in her hand. The parcel from the night sorting was already in the tray. Mrs. Henning's handwriting on the top one, neat and looping. A card going to her daughter in the north, Marin guessed. She set it gently in the rack and went to put the kettle on. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the best possible way. Marin worked her shifts. She made her soup. She walked the cart path in the evenings, though not always as far as the tree line. The hum below her ribs stayed quiet. She went back to the library on a Tuesday. The door opened before she knocked. Aldrich was already at the table with 2 cups of tea poured and a small plate of biscuits in the center. Shortbread, thick and golden. "I told you," he said. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the shelves around her. "I've been thinking about a book I want to leave here," she said. He looked at her with his pale gray-green eyes, interested but patient. "Waiting. The walk home," she said. That night, when the birches were glowing, he nodded slowly. "That's a good one. Is it already there?" she asked. He tilted his head and looked at the far wall for a moment. "Not yet," he said, "but give it time. The wood collects things at its own pace." Marin took a biscuit and bit into it. It was very good, buttery and just barely sweet. She looked at the rows of plain spines surrounding her and thought of the baker in the gray morning light, the man on the dock, all those moments someone had loved and needed to put somewhere safe. "Do people know this is here?" she asked. "The other people in the village," Aldrich considered. "Some have been, some will come, some never need to." He took a biscuit himself. The wood knows who to call. "It called me." "Yes," he said simply. She did not ask why. It felt, somehow, like a question with an answer already inside it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and the library settled around her with the quiet confidence of a place entirely at peace with what it was. The lamp burned. The tea cooled to the perfect temperature. Somewhere in the shelves, thousands of small moments waited in the dark between closed covers, perfectly kept. Marin finished her tea. She sat for a while longer after that, just listening to the silence. Aldrich read. The lamp burned. The biscuits were finished, one by one. Through the round windows, the forest was the quiet amber gray of late afternoon, the birches standing still, not a leaf moving. When she finally rose to go, she paused at the door again. The habit was forming, she realized. The pause at thresholds, the moment of standing in the doorway and feeling the weight of a place before she left it. "Same time next week?" she asked. Aldrich turned a page. "I'll put the kettle on." She stepped out into the clearing. The moss was deep and soft. The birches glowed faintly at the tree line. The air was cold and clean and smelled of bark and earth, and the distant, particular sweetness of wood smoke from somewhere further in the forest. She walked home through the trees in the failing light. Her footsteps made no sound on the moss. The wood breathed slowly around her, and the pages whispered, soft as sleep, all the way to the edge.